We begin our report around a long table in a rectangular private room inside a Manhattan courthouse where 12 New Yorkers are poring over notes from 16 days of testimony from 22 witnesses with 10,000 words of instructions by a judge to guide them. Their task? To be the judges of facts and decide whether the defendant, Donald Trump, is guilty or not guilty. It took about an hour for Judge Juan Merchan to give his instructions to the jury. To convict the former president, the jury must find that he made false entries in business records with the intent to defraud and intent to commit or conceal another crime, breaking any of the laws related to elections, taxes, or other business records. The verdict must be unanimous and based only on the evidence presented at trial. CBS News campaign reporter and attorney Katrina Kaufman has been covering all those days and all those witnesses, and she joins me now. So, what do you make of these jury instructions?
I mean, the jury instructions are such a crucial part of this case, and the judge took an hour this morning to explain them in detail to the jury, and they really could be very determinative of the outcome of this case. Just the way that the jurors have to apply the law to these very long story with a lot of facts, and it's also just a very layered charge. As you were saying, they have to both find that Trump falsified business records and that there was the intent to commit or conceal an underlying crime, which the prosecution says is a violation of the New York election law 17-152. So he really had to explain the details of all of this to them and how to define these laws.
And just on that question of the that he falsified the documents to cover up or another crime, the jury can pick and choose, right, between any of the possible other crimes. In other words, it can be election law, state election law, federal election law, or tax law or business law. They can kind of pick from any of those, right?
Yes, that's what's really interesting, because there has to be an element of unlawful means, but they don't all have to be unanimous on what those unlawful means are. So as you were saying, it could be a federal election crime, it could be a tax crime, or it could be falsification of other business records. And that actually could be potentially the simplest way to a conviction for Donald Trump, because those business records could be tax records, 1099s that the Trump organization issued to Michael Cohen, for example, or when Michael Cohen set up these LLCs that he used to pay back Stormy Daniels, he admitted on the stand that he told a lot of false information when he was setting those up. So that's another avenue here for fulfilling this unlawful means requirement.
And Katrina,
and actually, it was interesting. I was sitting. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
I was just saying, I was sitting next to a retired judge in court, actually, and he was saying that until today, and take this with a grain of salt, he felt like he was 80% sure that he could see a conviction in this case. But once he heard the jury instructions today that laid out these other falsified records that could be used as unlawful means, it made him even more confident that the jury could potentially unanimously decide to convict Donald Trump.
Fascinating. Now, what do you make of the two, or I should say, of the requests made by the jury, the questions they asked for, the clarifications? How do you read those?
Those were very key moments. And one thing that is interesting is they asked for 4 parts of testimony to be read back. 2 of them are related to a key Trump Tower meeting that took place between Michael Cohen, David Pecker, and Donald Trump. And this is the meeting where they allegedly devised this catch and kill scheme to suppress damaging stories, ultimately leading to the alleged payoffs of Stormy Daniels. But the jury wants to hear about that meeting, both from David Pecker's testimony and from Michael Cohen's testimony. So it's very interesting that they want to hear both sides of that meeting. Perhaps they want to contrast and compare what they said about it, see if it aligns, whether it corroborates what Michael Cohen said, for example, who obviously his credibility has been greatly undermined during this trial. And then another part they wanted to hear about was a phone call that David Pecker had said he received from Donald Trump at the time he was at an investor meeting in New Jersey. He said it was very memorable and that Trump had called him to talk about Karen McDougal. Pecker testified that Cohen had talked to Trump about whether they should buy Karen McDougal's story. Trump wanted to discuss it with David Pecker, and at the time, David Pecker said that he really thought they should buy the story, and Trump said on the call that he felt like whenever people do that, the story always tends to get out, which is very ironic given what happened in this case. But these are very important moments that came up in closing arguments, and the jury clearly wants to take a closer look at what was said on the stand about them. Katrina Kaufman from busy downtown New York City. Thank you, Katrina.
Hello, everyone. I'm Major Garrett in Washington. Welcome to America Decides. Former President Trump's legal fate, at least in one jurisdiction facing one set of charges, is tonight in the hands of a New York jury. Day one of deliberations in his criminal case there has just ended. The 12 jurors will return tomorrow as they consider the 34 felony charges of falsifying business records. The former president, during one of the breaks in legal action today, slammed the process.
Mother Teresa could not beat these charges. These charges are rigged. The whole thing is rigged.
Our Errol Barnett is outside the courthouse in Lower Manhattan. Errol, summarize the day. What did the jury ask for, and what might it mean?
Major, for the first time, these 12 New Yorkers will now have the ability to discuss this historic case with each other and determine if Donald Trump is guilty or not guilty. The first clues 4 hours into deliberation as to which aspects of this case they're most interested in all relate to either testimony from Michael Cohen or Trump confidant David Pecker or conversations that took place in Trump Tower. The prosecution has always maintained that an August 2015 meeting at Trump Tower was the core and the nexus of a conspiracy ahead of the 2016 election to effectively mislead voters by having David Pecker, a former tabloid publisher, suppress negative stories about Trump, amplify negative stories about his opponents, and effectively pave the way for him to get to the White House. Some of the other key testimony that jurors have requested transcripts of that they will hear first thing tomorrow relate to David Pecker's phone conversation with Donald Trump as it related to Karen McDougal. At that time, Pecker testified that Trump encouraged him to purchase McDougal's story in order to kill it. Why is this relevant? Because the judge instructed the jury that in order to adjudicate this case, they have to divorce their personal opinions, their personal bias. Donald Trump is innocent until proven guilty, and the jurors have to believe beyond a reasonable doubt that Trump falsified the checks to Michael Cohen, these business records, in order to further another crime. That other crime, which makes all of this a felony, would be pursuing legal office through unlawful means. The prosecution has said the suppression of negative stories in this conspiracy is the proof that there was an unlawful intent in the first place. And so that's this early indication with only a few hours of deliberation that these jurors are focusing on the law and trying to follow the judge's instructions to them as closely as possible.
That's a brilliant summary, Errol, and I'm so grateful for it. You mentioned twice the instructions to the jurors from the judge. As I understand it, they've asked for those to be represented to them in some form or fashion. How will that happen? What might that mean?
It's almost an archaic kind of relic of the New York judicial process. The jurors have a laptop, and the laptop contains the hundreds of pieces of evidence throughout this 6-week trial. But the hundreds of pages, or I think it was like a few dozen pages of Judge Merchan's jury instructions to them is not with them in the jury deliberation room. And so as they all have these conversations with each other, this cross-section of New Yorkers, men and women of different ages, from different professional backgrounds, they want to make sure that they're following the guidance from the judge. So the day ended by them asking the judge or a clarification, whereas the judge said, well, if you want me to reread the instructions, that will take an hour. So perhaps narrow exactly what it is you want reread. And all of that will be read to the jurors tomorrow morning. But yes, they have a laptop. They've got the digital access to the evidence that was presented in this case. But if they want to be reminded, it's kind of like when you take one of those tests and it's a closed note test. If they want to be reminded as to what the jury instructed them, they'll need to specifically ask for that guidance.
Excellent summary, as always. Errol Barnett, outside the courthouse in Manhattan. Thank you so very much.
We are hearing now from my producer that what we've learned is that the jury is requesting to hear again the judge's instructions. Combining that with what we know that they just asked for, those transcripts of 4 specific pieces of testimony earlier, Walk us through what all of this is indicating.
This effectively means, Lana, that these 12 jurors are taking their civic duty seriously. They're applying their own sense of common sense, and they need, in order to bring back a guilty verdict, to see beyond a reasonable doubt that Donald Trump was the mastermind of a scheme that misled voters and was effectively violating campaign finance laws and falsifying documents. The initial questions they had for additional information centered around David Pecker and the Trump Tower meeting in August of 2015. Those are key components because it doesn't include necessarily Michael Cohen, although they did ask for some of Cohen's testimony as it relates to the Trump Tower meeting. Now, they need to believe, in order to return a guilty verdict, that Donald Trump was the mastermind behind the conspiracy, that he knew that he would benefit from suppressing these stories, and that when he wrote those checks back to Michael Cohen under legal expenses, he knew that it wasn't true, when in fact he was trying to repay Cohen for the initial hush money payment. It's also significant that within the past 10 minutes or so, the jury has also requested to hear more of Judge Merchan's instructions. If we rewind back to this morning, it took about an hour for the judge to lay out to the jury not only what their civic duty is and how they don't include their opinions, but how specifically to apply the law to the charges against Donald Trump. And part of those instructions included the judge clarifying that the other crime that Trump will have had to have committed in order for this to be a felony can be defined any one of three ways. Those three ways were falsifying business records, that's the unlawful means part of the violation, breaking the Federal Election Campaign Act, or submitting false information on a tax return. The instructions from Judge Merchan this morning to the jury was that it's not only finding that Donald Trump falsified the business documents, but they must find that he did it in pursuit of unlawful means, pursuing an election through unlawful means. And I just read to you the three categories under which the jury can find that he was unlawful. Also, they don't need to find that Donald Trump did all three, that he falsified the business records, that he broke the Federal Election Campaign Act, and that he submitted a false tax return. They just need to find that it's one of those three for any of the 34 falsification records. So I know that's a lot to kind of take in, but for the jury, it's a lot to listen to this morning as well. And it's likely why they are now asking for key pieces of testimony that I understand will be read back to them and key portions of Judge Merchan's instructions. I think the last note I saw was that they want to get more guidance from the jury on which piece of the instructions do you want to hear, because it will take a full hour to read the entire instructions again. But certainly, early evidence with 4 hours plus as they deliberate, that they're taking their jobs quite seriously, and they very well could be close to a verdict.
Right. And you're right, Errol, there were the basic instructions, and then there were those that were particular to this case. And Jessica, given that complexity in a way of these instructions, particularly there were instructions about Michael Cohen's testimony and whether, if you thought he was lying, if you could, like, how you should interpret then anything about his testimony, take part of it, take all of it. Why is it that the jurors are not able to actually have those instructions given to them in printed form, that they actually have to have those delivered orally to them? And same with the testimony. As you heard Errol say, that testimony will be reread to them as opposed to transcripts being provided. Since you mentioned, Jessica, that most of us do not spend time in the legal system understanding the specifics of how the system works, help our viewers better understand that.
So one thing I'll just note at the outset is that the judge correctly said, do you want everything back? Because that took an hour. So he's saying, is there maybe something specific I can offer you instead of going back through all of the jury instructions? What's also interesting is he said, I want to know if the laptop they have there has Wi-Fi connectivity. And if it does, can we shut that down? Which to me indicates, and again, we're hypothesizing here, but there's some worry that they might try and maybe do their own research. They might try and call up their own jury instructions. Now, with respect to the jury instructions and the evidence. I will say this is not atypical to say these are things that you'll hear in the courtroom. And sometimes, depending on the rules of evidence, depending on what that evidence is used for, again, sometimes evidence is used for something called the truth of the matter asserted. Sometimes it's used for impeachment, that judges will be more lenient in saying, let's send that back to the jury. And the jury will go back into a deliberation room and they will have just binders and binders and boxes of evidence. That's not typical. Typically, you'll have to say, can I hear a little bit more from, or we would like a read back, or can we see again? In part because that is just a better and safer way to store evidence, frankly.
Jessica, what are the rules for the jury then? Normally, they'd be out at 4:30. Actually, in weeks past, they have not been in session on Wednesdays. If they want to go deep into the night tonight, are they able to do so in their deliberations?
So again, I think within the discretion of the judge, if they want to go deep into the night, let's be honest, that means it's not just them in the courtroom. So what the judge would have to determine is if they can keep the lights on in the courtroom, if the attorneys will be willing to stay, if there are court security staff who can stay and frankly be paid overtime in order to make sure that the jury can deliberate in a safe and conditions. And so it's not as simple as the jury saying to the judge, we want to pull an all-nighter. One, I think the judge will want them to take a break because most of us know you don't function as well on zero sleep. But second, again, in any courtroom, there's a bunch of staff that has to be there in order for the court to stay open with jurors there. And so that would be the determination. And the attorneys would have to agree as well.
And Errol, I don't know if you've had an opportunity to see, but some of our CBS campaign reporters have been talking to people across the country about how they're perceiving this case. And one of the things that you mentioned before is about the defense trying to make the case that Michael Cohen is somebody who's not trustworthy for testimony that's believable. And we're seeing that actually reverberated back in what we're hearing from voters out across America. How is all of this playing into the greater campaign that's happening for president?
Well, it's clear that, as we've said many times, the courtroom's become the campaign trail, and you have not only Trump's surrogates joining him at times outside and inside the courtroom, but you've had for the first time the Biden-Harris campaign also place surrogates outside the courtroom and rail against Donald Trump. But I'll just bring you the latest information we have from inside the courthouse to give you a sense of the color of all of this, because while, yes, he is campaigning for president, in this scenario, Donald Trump is a criminal defendant, and he must sit inside the courtroom and wait. And so our reporters who are there are saying that as the jury is brought back into the room to discuss with the judge exactly what they want to see as far as these transcripts, we're just showing you some recent polling showing that most Americans do believe that Donald Trump either will definitely or probably be found guilty. And in addition, most Americans believe that this jury will come back with a guilty verdict for Donald Trump. We're learning that as the jury is being brought back in and then ushered back out, none of them are making eye contact with Donald Trump, who is still seated in the courtroom. And we understand that as the judge is asking for clarification on exactly what portions of a transcript that they want read back, we are now understanding that after they send another note clarifying exactly what pieces of testimony they want to hear from Trump confidant David Pecker and Michael Cohen as it relates to the Trump Tower meeting, after they get that note clarifying, the jury will likely be sent home today so we can hit this 4:30 p.m. ending time, and that tomorrow, when things resume at roughly 9:30 in the morning, the judge will then read portions of these transcripts back to the jury and likely also reread portions of his guidance for the jury. So that's the sense we're getting now, as we had 4 hours plus of deliberations today. The jury has had a number of key questions from key moments from the prosecution's case, and tomorrow the judge and the staff will get those portions reread to the jury as things and deliberations continue as they ultimately decide Donald Trump's fate.
And Errol, as you point out, we do not know how long these deliberations could continue. It will continue tomorrow at least, but we don't know if it'll continue for days or weeks beyond that time. But do talk to us about what the potential penalties could be faced if, in fact, the jury does return a guilty verdict.
Well, that's what's interesting. These are felonies, 34 felony counts that Donald Trump faces. And these are in New York, Class E felonies, which are the lowest category, and carry with them a $5,000 fine each, or up to 4 years in prison each. But it's likely for someone like Donald Trump, who would be a first-time offender and who is older and who has what is considered a kind of distinguished background as a former president, he would not likely serve prison time for this, and also sentencing wouldn't come for another 30 or 60 days, and he can request, we can expect that he would appeal a guilty verdict, but they can also request that sentencing be delayed until a much later time. But these felonies for falsifying business records carry the weight of a felony instead of a misdemeanor, so long as the jury finds that he falsified those records to further another crime, that other crime being pursuing an election through unlawful means. And earlier he walked through what those unlawful means may be. But it's easy to see that if the jurors believe Trump is guilty for writing one of these checks, because there's 11 checks with 11 corresponding invoices and I think 12 voucher entries that reflect them both, if they find him guilty for one, it's likely they'll find him guilty on all 34. And so then the United States would be facing a scenario where you would have a convicted felon running for president. Truly uncharted waters. And besides all the politics, it's just these 12 New Yorkers who will ultimately decide what happens next.
And Jessica, on that note, this is one of several trials that the former president is facing. Will the decision that the jury reaches in this trial, given that it is the first one up in terms of a criminal trial, there were other trials, of course, about defamation and about the Trump business and falsifying those records. But given that this one is actually focused on the former president, might it have an effect in any of the other legal challenges that he's currently facing?
It's a great question. And the answer for all of us should be, regardless of the outcome, we hope not, right? Because as we've been talking about, Lana, as Errol has been reporting, what the jury has to do is not determine, do I like Trump? Do I think he's a criminal? Do I think he's somebody who's likely to do this? They have to look at the specific evidence in this courtroom, the specific jury instructions that they have, and determine whether or not these crimes were committed. The other cases have separate crimes. Now, we could talk about whether or not there's enough of an overlap between the federal election interference case and the Georgia election interference case, where if we were to get a verdict in one of those cases, could we then say, this tells us something about the other? But with respect to this case, different set of facts. With respect to, again, the Florida case, the Mar-a-Lago case, dealing with the alleged unlawful retention of classified documents, totally separate allegations. And the two election interference cases, those are about the 2020 election. This case is about the 2016 election. So I would say for all of us who believe in the criminal justice system, let's hope that it doesn't mean anything about what could happen in another courtroom.
All right. And we are still waiting to hear how the jury will ultimately decide, as they have asked for additional instructions and testimony, and will resume deliberations later tomorrow. Errol Barnett, Jessica Levinson, thank you both. And the jury in Donald Trump's criminal trial out of New York has returned to the courtroom, and so has the former president. I want to get back over to Jessica Levinson. She has been following all of this for us. So, Jessica, explain to us what's going on at the courthouse right now.
So the jury's doing exactly what we want them to do. They're going through the evidence and they're trying to figure out whether or not there's enough here to convict. And they're zeroing in on what I think is one of the key moments in this case, which is the meeting at the Trump Tower. They're trying to figure out if there was, in fact, this agreement to catch and kill negative stories about then candidate Trump. And they're trying to figure out if they can tie Trump to that agreement. And so all of this has always really been about two things. One was their criminal behavior, and two, can you tie the former president to it? And I think that the jury here is going to the heart of it. They're trying to figure out what was the arrangement between people like David Pecker, who ran American Media, which owned the National Enquirer. What was the arrangement that was made to try and gobble up and silence stories that were negative about then candidate Trump that could potentially hurt him with the voters? And they're trying to figure out if Trump knew about that, if he helped to direct this scheme. And so many things will fall into place for the prosecution if the jury believes what they explained to them and what their witnesses explained about that Trump Tower meeting. Last thing I want to note is, looking at the time, looking at these 4 questions, I don't think you and I are going to be saying today, and we have a verdict.
Yes, these questions from the jurors, 3 of them regarding David Pecker's testimony. 1, the phone conversation that Pecker had with Donald Trump. 2, the Pecker's decision regarding Karen McDougal's story and funding the assignment of those rights. 3, Pecker's testimony about that Trump Tower meeting that you just mentioned, Jessica. And then 4, Michael Cohen's testimony about that Trump Tower meeting. Does any of this tell you about where the jury finds themselves right now in their discussions?
Right. Does this, and I think that the question, of course, also is, where are they? Meaning, are they just in the beginning, or are they close to a verdict? And who is this good or bad for? And so what I would say is, the fact that they're zeroing in on this means, I think, that they are at least past the beginning of the beginning when it comes to the questions that they're considering here. I have to say, I think that Trump's team is probably not thrilled about these particular questions, because if you can, again, based on what they're asking, the particular witness's testimony that they're asking about, if the jury looks back at this and says, you know what, the prosecution was right, that's extremely powerful for the prosecution's case. Having said that, look, I wouldn't be a lawyer if I didn't point out both sides. Having said that, the prosecution, I'm sure, was really hoping no questions. They go back there and say, oh my gosh, can you believe he's not just a little guilty, he's absolutely guilty on all 34 counts. Let's take a vote and let's be home for an early dinner. And obviously that's not what's happening either.
Obviously that's not what's happening. I want to bring back in Errol Barnett, who's outside of the courthouse. And Errol, you pointed out that we still have a lot of questions, but one that we don't have is that this is a decision by the jury. Yet you have been following this case and you've been seeing those jurors. What more can you tell us about how they're sorting through these developments right now?
Well, I'll say, Lana, that it's interesting that within 4 hours of deliberation, the jury is requesting more information in the terms of transcripts from David Pecker's testimony, and that it relates to Trump Tower meetings that the prosecution says was the launch pad for this entire scheme to mislead the American public, hide negative stories so Trump could win the White House. But it's also noteworthy because David Pecker proved himself to be someone who, while testifying against Donald Trump, still considers himself an ally, a friend. He even considers Donald Trump a mentor of his. And so the jury is obviously taking that into consideration and really valuing his testimony. He agreed, according to his testimony, to be Donald Trump's eyes and ears on the campaign trail. And what the judge and prosecution laid out was that it wasn't just enough to prove that a hush money payment was sent out. It wasn't enough to prove that Donald Trump falsified the business records. In order for this 12-person jury to return a guilty verdict, they must believe beyond a reasonable doubt that Donald Trump knew about this scheme, he implemented the scheme, that the other witnesses we heard for were effectively co-conspirators of the scheme, and that he benefited from it in some way. Pecker's testimony in which he has conversations with Donald Trump while Pecker was in an investor meeting certainly speaks to that connective glue and that connective tissue we've spoken about for so many weeks, which is crucial for the jury to return a guilty verdict. It's not enough to believe any one of these witnesses by themselves to return a guilty verdict. They must believe that Donald Trump implemented this plan, benefited from this plan, and if they do find him guilty on one of the 34 counts, it's likely, because these are all for the same effective offense, 11 checks, 11 invoices, and the corresponding voucher records, it's likely they will find him guilty on all 34. We don't know that for sure yet. Deliberations continue, but evidently 4 hours in, this is the information they want to see and have read back to them is quite noteworthy.
And I'm so glad that you pointed out the relationship, Errol, between David Pecker and Donald Trump, because so much of what we heard from the defense was that you couldn't really fully trust in their minds the testimony that we were hearing from Michael Cohen, who had been a longtime confidant of the former presidents, but their relationship soured, or the relationship, or the testimony rather, from Stormy Daniels. Given the defense's positioning right now, Errol, I'm wondering if you can tell us anything more about the case that they are trying to make, because as you laid out, the prosecution has tried to say not only can you trust the testimony, you can also trust the records. But what did the defense have to say about all of that?
The defense was quite simple. Donald Trump never had the alleged affair with Stormy Daniels. He never told Michael Cohen to make the payoff. The defense says Michael Cohen decided to do that himself, and then Daniels and Cohen conspired to extort Trump for money. They also say, and they want the jury to believe, that despite that, Trump had a retainer agreement with Cohen after he won the White House in 2016 and simply paid him for those legal services in these multiple checks in the amount of $35,000 for those services, and ultimately cut ties with Cohen after he pleaded guilty to his role in this scheme. And that Cohen is just bitter. He's just someone trying to make money for his podcasts and go on a speaking circuit and continue to say all the things he said. The problem with the defense as they try to lay out that argument, particularly when they try to say to Cohen, you're just doing this for yourself to make money, Cohen actually shot back and said, well, I would actually make more money if Donald Trump was found not guilty of these crimes, because that would be more noteworthy and I could continue to speak and do what I do. So perhaps the defense's efforts to create an alternate reality from what the prosecution has laid out may not be carrying as much weight with the jury, which again just has to use their own common sense and believe that beyond a reasonable doubt that there's enough evidence in testimony, in the audio clips, the video clips, the cash, the communications between all the key players to believe that, yes, Donald Trump was behind this scheme and benefited from the scheme specifically to win the election in 2016. So the defense has shot back and tried to shoot holes in all of this. But if the jury wants to see this testimony, they are trying to make sure that they're making these judgments based on the law and based on what is beyond a reasonable doubt in their minds.
All right. The jury requesting 4 additional pieces of information as their deliberations continue. Errol and Jessica, thanks.
All right, it's 11:38 in the morning here on the East Coast in New York City, where jury deliberations have begun in former President Donald Trump's criminal trial. Prosecutors accused Trump of falsifying business records to cover up a payment made to adult film actor Stormy Daniels. The former president has pleaded not guilty to all charges. Let's bring in our Errol Barnett, who is standing outside of the courtroom right now. All right, Errol, in the last hour, we were talking about the instructions that the judge was giving the jury, and now at about 11:30 in the morning, you can correct me on the timeline, that jury is now deliberating.
That's exactly right, Vlad. At this moment, those 12 jurors, those New Yorkers, those peers of Donald Trump are inside the deliberation room in the state courthouse you see behind me, but they will slowly and meticulously walk through the 34 felony counts that Trump faces and decide his innocence or guilt. Now, they have the option at any time as they speak to each other to request additional evidence, to review transcripts, audio audio clips, video clips, which have been an element of the more than 200 exhibits that the prosecution brought forward. And that will give us a sense on if they're united and they'll get to a decision quickly, or if there may be some division and they need more time. When it comes to time, we understand that the judge has instructed that they will likely finish the day by 4:30 p.m. Eastern. So the rough math on that is that they have a good 5 hours today to walk through these 34 felony counts. And before the jurors went into that deliberation room, these 7 men, these 5 women from a cross-section of occupations, and some of them retired, before they went into the jury room, they were told that they have to determine 2 key questions. The first is, did Donald Trump falsify business records? And the second is, did he do so with an intent? And the intent is the key word, to cover up another crime. How they determine that, yes, it's the law as they've been instructed this morning, but it is also based on their personal experience. As you saw there, the prosecution has to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Donald Trump is guilty. But we can all ask ourselves, what's reasonable? This is up to the jury based on their life experience, based on their common sense, and based on everything that they've watched unfold in the courthouse. Were they swayed by Michael Cohen? That will be a key question, since the defense made him the key character of its closing arguments, and saying that you can't trust the thing that Donald Trump's former lawyer says, because he's admitted to lying and he's proven himself untrustworthy. Whereas the prosecution says, even if you don't believe that Michael Cohen is a trustworthy person, consider what he testified to that was corroborated by David Pecker, by Hope Hicks, by other people in the Trump orbit as it relates to this scheme, as far as the prosecution is concerned, to conceal from the American public the truth about Donald Trump and allegations against him as it relates to a sexual encounter. The prosecution says when Donald Trump repaid Michael Cohen once he won the White House with these checks, which showed him as having a retainer agreement, that was a falsification of a business record. And the crime, the prosecution says, that covered up was the pursuit of the White House while keeping information from the American public. So it's now, Vlad, in the jurors' hands. They're sitting around a table from one another for the first time. They haven't been able to talk about this case with friends, family, spouses. They haven't been watching you or myself cover this trial. They haven't heard a thing Donald Trump says. They're supposed to have been they're sequestered now, but during this trial they are instructed not to listen to any of the noise. Not just the noise in the park next to me, but the noise around the trial. And so now it's their first opportunity as a team to go over the evidence and discuss with each other whether they are unified on a verdict or not. An investment banker, a software engineer, teachers, product development specialists, men and women, various ages. They've really paid a lot of attention, I've noticed, throughout these past 6 weeks and the 5 weeks of testimony.
What we're showing, Errol, just so our audience can understand, we're not going to take the former president. He is, but we're showing a live picture right now, Errol, just so you know, of former President Donald Trump, who is making comments outside of the courtroom as opposed to the courthouse, outside of the courthouse where you are. And it's a litany of his greatest hits, given that the hours and minutes of live television coverage that the former president receives can almost be seen as an in-kind donation to the campaign. We're just showing you that he's making those comments. But let's continue discussing your point about Michael Cohen. Michael Cohen, at one point, you reiterated what the former president's lawyer said, which is that he's a liar and that the jury should not take anything that he testifies as truth. But the prosecution was able to say, well, that is what makes Michael Cohen such a compelling witness, Errol, because he was Donald Trump's liar.
That's right. The prosecution even said, we didn't find Michael Cohen at the witness store. No, he is an imperfect witness. And consider that this is a person that Donald Trump chose to be in his orbit. In trying to acknowledge Michael Cohen's strengths and weaknesses, the prosecution characterized overall a scheme led by Donald Trump that we've heard before compared to how mob bosses and mob families are run. That Donald Trump values above all else loyalty. And as soon as Donald Trump saw that Michael Cohen wasn't being loyal and Michael Cohen wouldn't take the fall for these hush money payments, the team around Trump turned on Cohen. So the prosecution didn't deny any of Cohen's shortcomings. In fact, they used that to make it a part of their case that Donald Trump, what did they say? He corrupted the people around him and used them until it was convenient, only up until it's convenient for Donald Trump. So you're right. The jury will have issues with Cohen.
Yeah. Stand by, Errol, while I bring in CBS News legal contributor Jessica Levinson to talk more about this. So, Jessica, now the jury has begun their deliberations. Just remind our audience exactly what it is that they were instructed to decide and what it is that they should not be focused on. In other words, there are people who are watching this that have drawn political inferences from what is happening in that Manhattan courtroom. But what should the jury be focused on, and what should they be specifically deliberating?
I love that question because it really focuses on something that Errol has also been reporting and I think is so important, which is focus on the difference between what happens inside the courtroom, which, as Errol's been reporting, is frankly somewhat dry at times, where the judge spending an hour going through the typical jury instructions, talking about the presumption of innocence, talking about the burden of proof, and then separate that from the circus, frankly, that's happening outside the courtroom, because those are two very different things. And the jury's not looking at a press conference. The jury is not looking at political polling. The jury is not looking at the next election. The jury is looking at something, frankly, much more detailed and completely different, right? Were these business records falsified, and were they falsified in order to try to unlawfully undermine the election? That's what it's coming down to. And, Vlad, we've talked a lot about the other criminal cases that are pending against the former president. This is almost certainly the only one that will go to trial before the election. It's frankly bearing more weight than it otherwise should have, than any criminal case should. But that is the question at the heart of this. Were the business records falsified in order to try and unlawfully influence the election? It has nothing to do with who's in the courtroom at what time, what are they saying outside of the courtroom. Anything that the former president says, he didn't testify, so they can't consider anything he says.
Let me ask you, Jessica, the jury heard closing arguments yesterday, and we know what the statistics show about opening arguments, that oftentimes juries' minds are made up even before they hear all the evidence. A lot of what they are thinking about is based on what they heard during the lawyer's opening argument. So how much, let's flip it, and I'm curious how much of the closing arguments impact the way juries consider the evidence that they've just spent days, and in often cases, in this case, weeks, hearing.
First impressions, last impressions, they are really important. So I'm going to give you somewhat of an it depends answer, in the sense that it's typically hard to turn a jury at closing arguments. This is a complicated case. This is a case where I think a lot more, maybe than is the case in other criminal cases, a lot more hinged on the prosecution saying it was complicated. You heard from a lot of people. You saw a lot of evidence. Let's tie it all together and tell you what it was really about. If I think of this as a professor, it's kind of the review session where you went through all these details in the cases, and then you say, what are we really trying to do here? We're really just trying to find different ways to protect the freedom of speech. In terms of the prosecution, they're going to say, what are we trying to do here? We're trying to show you that Trump knew the business records were falsified. He caused them to be falsified. And why did he do that? Because it's right after the Access Hollywood tapes. It's right before the election. He doesn't want you to hear the story that you heard from Stormy Daniels. And so perhaps in this case, more than other cases, those closing arguments are important because the case is complex, and it allows the jury to step back and say, okay, what really happened here?
Jessica, in just a moment, my colleague Lana Zak is going to join this discussion as we report the news now that the jury is finally begun deliberating the charges against former President Donald Trump. But here's another question for you when it comes to the judge specifically. In the worst case scenario for the former president, that he is found guilty of these charges, what kind of leeway does the judge have? What would happen next in the best case scenario for the former president and the worst case scenario?
So the worst case scenario is prison time. Not a lot of prison time, but let's remember that we are talking about a potential felony conviction here, or felony convictions. I think the best case scenario, if there is a conviction, and frankly more likely, is that you would not see prison time, that you would in fact see something akin to probation instead. Not house arrest, but probation. And that's because this is a first-time offense. These, again, are not violent crimes, and it is well within a judge's discretion to say, I don't think a prison sentence is appropriate here, just as it is well within his discretion to say he thinks that it is. But I do want to caution people, if there is a conviction, do not expect that we will say, and therefore Donald Trump is behind bars on Friday. It's not going to happen that way. There will be a delay before sentencing, and then the sentence, I think, again, if there is a conviction, we have to acknowledge that it's highly likely that there would not be prison time or significant prison time.
All right, Jessica, stand by. I want to bring back CBS News correspondent Errol Barnett, who is standing outside of the courthouse, where if you're just joining us, we can tell you now that the jury deliberations are underway in former President Donald Trump's hush money trial. And Errol, as you know, as Jessica knows as well, these things might last an hour or two, and it might last a week or two. We simply do not know. But of course, you are there on the ground. And I want to talk specifically, Errol, about that, and I'm going to put it in air quotes, that handwritten note, which is at the crux of this prosecution. Break it down for me.
That's right, Vlad. So as now jury deliberations get underway, one of the key things we should be looking out for are questions they have and evidence that they may request to review. The judge has already said that for Donald Trump and the lawyers representing him, everyone should stay in the courthouse so that juror questions can be answered as soon as possible. What you're seeing on your screen is what I think one of the key pieces of evidence that ties everything together. They're handwritten notes on Trump's stationery by Trump Organization executives that were written by Jeffrey McConney. He's a former corporate controller at the Trump Organization, and he testified that this broke down the repayment to Cohen. So this ties the hush money payment to the checks that are the bedrock of the felony counts against Trump. And what you're seeing in those notes were the math as dictated to him by Alan Weisselberg, who was Trump's right-hand man at the Trump Organization and a man who already admitted to his part in this scheme. And those numbers show, handwritten, that the initial repayment to the initial hush money payment to Stormy Daniels was repaid, totaling some $360,000, and that included the $180,000 expense to offset taxes. It included another $50,000 for tech services, an additional bonus for Michael Cohen of $60,000, and so for the jurors, they will need to decide that when they combine this with testimony from Cohen and everyone else in this scheme, if this proves that Donald Trump really was behind it all. As we remember from the judge's instructions, the jury has to not only believe that Donald Trump committed a crime by writing these checks that said legal retainer for or retainer for legal services, they have to also agree that that was done in order to cover up another crime, that being election interference by suppressing negative information and keeping it from the public. That document we just saw is one example that perhaps the jury has already seen enough of and they've already made up their minds, but perhaps they may want to see again, since the defense tried to argue that Donald Trump isn't anywhere on those documents, while the prosecution says these are all people who were following the direction of Trump, and it's reasonable. Remember, they have to believe guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. It would be reasonable to believe that that document proves that there really was a scheme that connected the hush money payments to the repayments to Cohen from Trump in 2017 when Trump had already won the White House. So by now, the jury has been deliberating for roughly 20 minutes. It's still early minutes and hours, but as these hours move on, we think they'll be dismissed by 4:30 p.m. this afternoon, this evening. They very well may ask for more evidence and more pieces of evidence to review in order to reach their judgment. And so that's the next thing I'm looking for right now is the jury is behind closed doors. None of us are allowed in there. This is all done privately, but we'll get hints and clues as to where their thinking may be if and when they ask to review evidence that's been shown during this trial.
All right, Errol, thank you. I'm Lana Zak, taking over now for Vladimir Duthier. If you're just tuning in, the jury has begun deliberations in the criminal trial against Donald Trump here in New York. We also, in addition to Errol Barnett, are joined by Jessica Levinson, our legal contributor. Jessica, just in the final moments that we have remaining before our necessary commercial break, how long might this deliberation take?
Well, I think Errol said this very well. It could take hours, if we see weeks, something bizarre is happening, I have to be honest. So I think we're looking at hours versus days. The faster it is, the better it is for the prosecution. If we get the word today, tomorrow, there is a verdict, I think that is really good for the prosecution.
And the other option, in addition to guilty and not guilty, is also the possibility of a hung jury. What might happen in that case?
So if there's a hung jury, I suspect, given what we've seen from Judge Merchan, who has presided over this courtroom, I think if they come back to him and say, we can't reach a decision, he's going to say, let's try again. Let's go back, focus on what's the problem here.
All right, Jessica and Errol, thank you very much.
It's 11 a.m. in New York City, where jury instructions are underway in former President Donald Trump's criminal trial. Prosecutors accuse Trump of falsifying business records to cover up a payment made to adult film actor Stormy Daniels. Trump has pleaded not guilty to all charges. Let's bring in Errol Barnett and CBS News legal contributor Jessica Levinson to talk a little bit more about this. So, Errol, we talked about the hush money payments, but it's really not about the hush money payments. There's nothing illegal about that. It's the hush money payments in order to influence the 2016 election and keep keep the story under wraps, if you will, for a particular reason. It's kind of complicated. So what did the judge tell the jurors about what they should be contemplating before they head into deliberations?
Well, it's really interesting, Anne-Marie and Vlad, because the entire trial really comes down to this moment, these 12 jurors, their opinions, their experiences, and what their view of Donald Trump's guilt or innocence is based on the testimony, based on the evidence that's been laid out, and based on the law. Judge Merchan, just a short time ago, told the jury what the fundamental principles are. Remember, weeks ago, they were summoned to a courthouse, as so many of our viewers have been, in order to adjudicate a case. He told them that you must not forget the fundamental principle here is that defendants are innocent until proven guilty, and the burden of proof is on the people. It shifts. It never shifts from the people to the defendant. And so the state has to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Donald Trump committed these crimes. He also emphasized and reminded the jurors that they were told to set aside any opinions, any bias they have for or against the defendant. And if they decide this case against the defendant and the law, you must set aside all of that. You must not allow opinion or bias to influence your decision. So that's the introduction the jurors received this morning before we got to the specific elements of the law. And just remember what these 12 jurors have been through already. They were filtered down from hundreds. There was a frenzy at the time the jury was selected of people being identified in the press. Some jurors ducked out and said, I just can't do it. There were tears in the courtroom at that time. So these 12 were the ones who remained, the ones who were committed to sitting through what has been more than 5 weeks of testimony. And now we're in this 6th week. And now for the first time, after the jury finishes giving them instructions, they're going to speak to each other for the first time. And you can see the range of occupations they come from, not just two attorneys who will be well familiar with the law, but you've got a speech therapist, a software engineer, a retired wealth manager, and someone coming from investment banking, Vlad's old world. And so it really is a cross-section of New Yorkers, and you're seeing kind of the idea of a democratic judicial system at work when they all now will sit across from the table from each other for the first time and say, what do you think? We expect that to happen at any moment.
Jessica, the jury, as we've been saying for the last couple of days, begins those deliberations today. Remind us of some of the specifics. I mean, Anne-Marie sort of pointed it out earlier that it's not about those hush money payments. It's about making those payments to influence an election.
That's exactly right. And the defense has said over and over again, there's nothing illegal about hush money payments. That's right. There's nothing illegal about trying to influence an election. That's right. But the details here are different than just those broad strokes. And so what the jury is going to have to find, as we've been talking about, is one, that those business records were falsified, not by mistake, not by accident, but that the former president caused those business records to be falsified, that he wasn't really paying Michael Cohen for legal services. He was repaying him for the hush money payments. And that the reason the records were falsified is to try and cover up or commit another crime. And that other crime is not just interfering with the election, but doing so in an unlawful way. And then what is that unlawful way? The prosecution is pointing to campaign finance issues, tax issues, and other falsification of business records. So it's going to take the jury a moment. On the one hand, I think that we can say, wow, that's a lot of steps for the jury. On the other hand, I think jurors have, and this isn't an inappropriate, kind of a gut sense of where they want to go. If they think the prosecution's story adds up, if they think that the prosecution proved this beyond a reasonable doubt, then I don't think we're going to see them hung up on each individual detail here. But a quick verdict is good for the prosecution. The longer it takes, the more excited the defense will be about their chances of a hung jury.
Errol, you've been outside of the courthouse pretty much every day. Aside from the senior fitness extravaganza that's happening close to you, it seems like in those last few weeks, there have been kind of more and more heavy hitters, if you will, showing up on behalf of the former president. And even yesterday, some star power on behalf of the Biden campaign showed up for the first time. What's the scene like outside of the courthouse this morning?
That's right, Anne-Marie. It's been fascinating to be inside the courthouse and see the judicial process underway and to see Donald Trump be tight-lipped, and then to see how it seems outside of the courthouse with Donald Trump making statements to the press and every now and then a few dozen pro-Trump supporters showing up at the park directly across the street from the courthouse, as well as anti-Trump protesters who would make their way down the street as well. We saw a large presence of both at the beginning of this trial, around the time of jury selection. That kind of ebbed and eased as we went through some of the star witnesses. And yes, in this last week, we've seen it kick up again. Yesterday was the largest contingency of Trump children we had seen, with Donald Trump Jr., Eric Trump, and Tiffany Trump. We also saw the House Speaker, Mike Johnson, show up at a certain stage and show support for Donald Trump. Members of the House Freedom Caucus have come to the courthouse and spoken about how this is also a sham trial, echoing Trump's words. But for the first time yesterday, we saw efforts from the Biden-Harris campaign to almost create some counter-programming with actor Robert De Niro and others who believe that Donald Trump isn't just someone who shouldn't be in the White House, but is a threat to democracy. So you've had this interesting split-screen experience covering this trial, where inside it's very dry, it's very methodical, it's very mechanical as far as how it moves through each process of a case. And while outside, it's been a little bit of a circus. I'll also share with you that at one point, a van filled with helium balloons opened behind the press and in front of the courthouse as images of Judge Merchant and Special Prosecutor Jack Smith were floating through the air. I mean, it was incredibly bizarre, and it was distributed by a pro-Trump supporter who says this trial is a sham. So there's been no shortage of political theatrics around this case, while inside that courthouse, it's been very dry and everything according to the law. A very kind of bizarre experience to watch this unfold these last 6 weeks.
Yeah. Jessica, are there additional considerations the judge has to take into account with these instructions due to Trump being such a divisive figure?
Well, I actually think it's kind of cuts the other way in the sense of the judge is going to say, this is a defendant. This is a criminal defendant. I know, and he's not going to say this explicitly, but I know that this is the former president of the United States. I know this is arguably one of the most famous criminal defendants in our nation's history. But listen to what I'm saying. Listen to the burden of proof. Listen to the questions presented. Listen to how you find the answers. And so on the one hand, I think we can say everybody has said to this jury, or the judge has said to this jury, this is a criminal defendant, equal justice under the law. On the other hand, I frankly think it strains common sense to think that in the back of their mind, they don't understand the implications here. And I think that could actually play potentially well for the defense in terms of they might be hesitant, and this is guessing, but they might be hesitant to say, we want to convict the former president because it would be such a historic first. The hope is that the jury goes back to that room and they say, let's talk about whether this person, this defendant, committed these criminal acts. And they don't say, let's talk about whether or not the former president committed these acts.
All right, Errol, Jessica, thank you both very, very much. We'll be checking in with you, of course, throughout the course of the day, especially if we do get a verdict within the next hour or so.